One last question I have is, when we spoke earlier, you said you noticed that the number of Black journalists covering climate justice has also increased since last year. And I wanted you to share about this and tell us a little bit more.
Yes, it's something that I think has happened quietly but quickly since the George Floyd massacre. And prior to last year, if I got requests to do radio interviews, TV, etc., if I got contacted by, say, 30 journalists, maybe one, if I were lucky, in every 2 or 3 years would be Black. It's completely flipped since last year. So even something like BNC, Black News Channel, I mean, they've been in touch with me 2 or 3 times just since last fall. NPR, the NPR stations, which are notoriously primarily white, they all have these young, and that's what's interesting about it, young Black journalists that are not just contacting for news stories, but for their own segments. So they're doing a lot of podcasts, St. Louis, all over New England. I've gotten contacted by these young African American NPR style journalists, something like 1A, which I listen to in my car, religiously. I just did a segment with 1A, and both of the journalists there were African American. In addition to that, I'm seeing a lot more print journalists who are also African American and Latinx contacting me. So everything from Bloomberg News, Gizmodo, The Wire, all these independent news sources now have sourced people of color journalists. And then you have the independent ones. So things like the Hip Hop Caucus, they run their own podcast. So they're reaching out to people like myself to do interviews with them. So it's created the space for especially Black journalism that I've never seen before. And then, of course, you have the traditional news pieces like the Washington Post, New York Times, the Globe, San Francisco Chronicle. They also seem now to have more people of color journalists. But the stories, the big scoops, are really now coming from this new breed of journalists who can get people like me to talk to them. And they're getting really incredible stories now that are certainly getting the word out, and they're on it at every turn. They seem to be more flexible than like a New York Times, but still, asking traditional questions. And by the time they get around to figure out that environmental organizations are predominantly white, these younger journalists are scooping that story now. Or this issue around funding in environmental organizations. A lot of journalists of color have picked up on that and are putting out the stories on that.